Boston, 1847. Ships arrived packed with Irish families fleeing the Great Famine, hungry, desperate, and carrying little more than memory. In the crowded streets and tenements of Boston, food became survival. Potatoes, cabbage, salted pork, scraps of fish, simple meals that filled empty stomachs and kept hope alive. But here's the hidden truth. Those very dishes didn't just feed the poor, they reshaped Boston's food culture forever. From stews and breads to chowders and puddings, the flavors of famine-era Ireland still echo in Boston kitchens today. This video will take you through 25 foods the Irish cooked in mid-1800s Boston, meals born out of hunger, grit, and faith. And some? You'd still recognize them on a Boston dinner table right now. 1. New England boiled dinner. Few meals captured the Irish struggle in Boston like the New England boiled dinner. Imagine a pot bubbling on a tiny tenement stove, corned beef sinking to the bottom, cabbage wilting on top, and root vegetables softening in between. It wasn't glamorous, but it was filling, and that mattered most. In Ireland, beef was a rare luxury, but in Boston's markets, salted corned beef was cheap and available. Paired with cabbage and potatoes, vegetables that reminded families of home, this one-pot dinner became a staple. It was practical, too. One pot meant less fuel, and leftovers could be mashed into hash the next day, stretching pennies even further. What started as a survival meal for desperate immigrants grew into a lasting tradition. Today, every St. Patrick's Day, Boston still serves up corned beef and cabbage by the plateful, a dish that connects generations to the resilience of their ancestors. 2. Irish stew. If the boiled dinner was Boston's Irish-American invention, Irish stew was the taste of home carried across the sea. In the cramped kitchens of South Boston, families simmered pots of mutton or cheap beef, potatoes, onions, and carrots, until everything melted together into a thick, hearty stew. It was the kind of meal that fed a crowd, warmed the bones, and reminded weary immigrants of what they'd left behind. Back in Ireland, lamb and mutton were the traditional meats. But in Boston, those cuts were hard to find, or too expensive. So the Irish adapted, often using whatever scraps the butcher couldn't sell. Potatoes and onions were plentiful and cheap, and with time, the stew became less about the meat and more about the comfort it brought. Irish stew wasn't just dinner, it was identity. Each spoonful carried memory, survival, and a stubborn kind of pride. To this day, a steaming bowl of it in Boston still tastes like resilience, family, and the will to endure. 3. Bacon and cabbage with boiled potatoes. If there was one dish that felt like Sunday dinner for Irish families in Boston, it was bacon and cabbage with boiled potatoes. It wasn't the thick-cut American bacon we know today. It was usually salted pork, boiled until tender, then sliced alongside soft cabbage and a pile of steaming potatoes. Simple, yes, but deeply satisfying. This meal was a direct link to Ireland. For generations, bacon and cabbage had been the centerpiece of Irish farmhouse tables. In Boston, it carried the same meaning: home, family, and a taste of dignity in the middle of poverty. Boiling everything in one pot kept cooking cheap and efficient, while the broth left behind could be reused for soups or stews. Nothing ever went to waste. Though it began as peasant food, bacon and cabbage rose to become a badge of heritage. In Boston's kitchens and pubs, it still stands as a proud reminder that the simplest meals can carry the heaviest meaning. 4. Salted pork with cabbage and turnips. When money was tight, and it almost always was, salted pork with cabbage and turnips kept Irish families in Boston fed. Pork was the cheapest meat at the docks, sold in barrels, heavily salted to last the long voyage from the Midwest. Immigrants would soak it to cut the salt, then boil it with cabbage and turnips until everything softened into a hearty, salty-sweet stew. It wasn't glamorous. The pork was often fatty or tough, but in those cramped tenements, it stretched farther than fresh meat ever could. Cabbage filled the pot, turnips added bulk, and together they created a meal that stuck to the ribs. For children who had known hunger during the famine, this dish was pure comfort, proof that in America there was at least something to eat. Salted pork and cabbage became a familiar scent in Boston's Irish neighborhoods, a reminder that even the toughest cuts and simplest vegetables could be turned into something that felt like home. 5. Barley soup with onions, carrots, and potatoes. On cold Boston nights, nothing stretched farther than a pot of barley soup. Irish families would toss barley into boiling water with onions, carrots, and potatoes, cheap ingredients that filled the pot and kept bellies warm. Meat was optional, and most times there wasn't any. The barley gave the broth body, turning scraps of vegetables into something that felt like a real meal. Back in Ireland, barley had long been a poor man's grain, used for bread, beer, and soup. In Boston, it carried that same role, affordable, filling, and dependable. Mothers could ladle out bowls for half a dozen kids, and everyone went to bed with at least something in their stomachs. Barley soup wasn't just survival, it was fellowship. Shared among families and neighbors, it proved that even in the hardest times, food had the power to bind people together and keep hope alive. 6. Oatmeal porridge with water or milk. Every Irish family in Boston knew this dish. It was breakfast, dinner, and sometimes the only thing on the table. Porridge, made with nothing more than oats boiled in water or, if fortune allowed, a splash of milk. It was plain, it was humble, but it filled the belly and kept hunger at bay. In Ireland, oats had been a staple for centuries. In Boston, they served the same purpose, but with a new urgency, keeping dock workers, factory hands, and young children from going hungry. A sprinkle of sugar or a pat of butter was a rare luxury. Most days, it was just a steaming bowl of oats and little else. Wealthier Bostonians may have dismissed porridge as poor man's food, but for the Irish it was strength in a bowl. Bowl after bowl, it carried families through the harshest winters and gave children the energy to face another day. 7. Irish soda bread with butter. Few smells brought comfort to an Irish immigrant kitchen like soda bread baking on a hearthstone. Made with flour, baking soda, salt, and buttermilk, it didn't require expensive yeast, just quick hands and a hot pan. In Boston's crowded tenements, soda bread became the daily staple, sliced thick and served with a smear of butter if the family could afford it. Back in Ireland, this bread was already tied to survival. It could be whipped up fast, baked in iron pots, and eaten warm to stretch out thin meals. In Boston, mothers relied on it the same way, turning meager ingredients into something filling and familiar. For kids who had crossed the ocean hungry, a chunk of soda bread meant safety. It meant they wouldn't go to bed starving that night. Today, Boston bakeries still sell Irish soda bread, especially around St. Patrick's Day, proving that what once kept families alive now connects generations. Each loaf carries the memory of resilience, survival, and the taste of home. 8. Boiled salt cod with potatoes and onions. Salt cod was the ocean's gift to poor immigrants. Cheap, preserved and sold by the slab on Boston's waterfront, it became a lifesaver for Irish families who couldn't afford fresh fish. They would soak it overnight to cut the salt, then boil it with potatoes and onions until everything softened into a hearty, salty stew. This dish carried echoes of Ireland, where saltfish had long been part of coastal diets. In Boston, it was even more common. Ships brought tons of it from Newfoundland and the Grand Banks, making it one of the most accessible proteins for the working poor. Families often ate it on Fridays when Catholic tradition required fish, but it showed up on weeknights too, when pennies were scarce. Salt cod wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable. It kept families fed through long winters, gave variety to tables ruled by potatoes and cabbage, and reminded the Irish that even in a strange new city, the sea still offered survival. 9. Pan-fried potatoes and onions with fat or bacon bits. If there was one dish that showed Irish thrift in Boston, it was pan-fried potatoes and onions. Leftover boiled potatoes were sliced thin, tossed into a hot pan with onions, and fried in whatever fat was on hand, sometimes lard, sometimes drippings, and on lucky days, a few crisp bits of bacon. This wasn't just food, it was ingenuity. Every immigrant mother knew how to stretch a single meal into two, and fried potatoes turned scraps into something hearty and comforting. The smell of sizzling onions filled cramped tenements, reminding families that even simple food could feel like a feast. Back in Ireland, potatoes had been life itself. In Boston, they still carried that role, but frying them gave a new flavor. Crispy edges, smoky bits, and a richness that boiling alone could never give. Over time, this skillet staple became a Boston favorite, proving that the simplest meals often leave the deepest mark. 10. Vegetable pottage with peas, turnips, and onions. In the crowded tenements of Boston, a bubbling pot of vegetable pottage was often the only thing standing between hunger and survival. Families would toss together whatever they had: dried peas, turnips, onions, maybe a stray carrot or cabbage leaf, and simmer it into a thick, earthy stew. It wasn't fancy, but it was filling, and every spoonful stretched a few pennies further. This dish had deep roots in Ireland, where pottage had been peasant fare for centuries. In Boston, it carried the same role: cheap, nourishing, and endlessly adaptable. Mothers could stretch one pot across several meals, dipping bread into the broth or thinning it with water when more mouths showed up at the table. For Irish immigrants, vegetable pottage proved that even the humblest scraps could be turned into comfort. In a world where meat was scarce and money tighter, this stew gave dignity to survival. It was the kind of dish that reminded families that even in the hardest times, they could still gather around a warm pot and share hope. 11. Colcannon. Colcannon was the taste of Ireland carried straight into Boston kitchens. Simple yet soulful, it was nothing more than mashed potatoes blended with boiled cabbage, or sometimes kale when cabbage wasn't at hand. A knob of butter on top turned the dish from plain into pure comfort. For Irish immigrants, colcannon wasn't just food, it was memory. Back home, it was a common peasant dish, served in nearly every cottage. In Boston, it reminded families of better days before the famine, when potatoes still filled the fields and hunger hadn't driven them across the sea. Children especially loved it, swirling the butter through the creamy mash and scraping every last bit from their plates. Though born from poverty, colcannon endured as a dish of pride. Families passed it down through generations, and in every spoonful was a reminder that hardship could be softened by tradition. Even in the toughest times, this simple bowl of potatoes and cabbage carried the flavor of hope. Who managed a little extra money, boiled ham with root vegetables felt like a feast. A cured ham hock or shank went into the pot, simmered long and slow until the meat softened and the broth grew rich. Around it, carrots, parsnips, turnips, and potatoes soaked up the flavor, stretching one piece of meat to feed a whole household. Back in Ireland, pork was the most familiar meat, often salted or smoked to last through lean times. In Boston, that tradition continued. Ham was cheaper than beef and more reliable than fresh cuts. It became the centerpiece of Sunday dinners when families gathered after church, sharing not just food, but a rare sense of celebration. What began as an affordable substitute grew into a community dish, one that carried meaning far beyond the table. Even today, a pot of boiled ham and vegetables is more than dinner. It's a tradition that links generations and keeps Irish heritage alive in Boston kitchens. 13. Boiled oats, steel-cut oats with milk or water. If there was one dish that never left the Irish table, whether in Dublin or Boston, it was boiled oats. Steel-cut oats, simmered slowly in water or on lucky days in milk, filled the morning air with a nutty, hearty smell. It wasn't sweet, it wasn't fancy, but it gave strength to dock workers, maids, and children heading out into the rough Boston streets. In Ireland, oats had been survival food for centuries, a steady breakfast for farmers and laborers. In Boston, the tradition continued, with families buying oats in bulk because they were cheap, filling, and easy to store. Sometimes a drizzle of molasses or a splash of cream brightened the bowl, but more often it was eaten plain, proof that sustenance mattered more than flavor. For the Irish, a steaming bowl of oats wasn't just breakfast, it was endurance in a spoon, a steady reminder that even the simplest food could carry them through another hard day. 14. Brown bread with lard or butter. Brown bread was the everyday staple in Boston's Irish kitchens. Dark, hearty, and made with coarse flour or cornmeal, it was cheap to bake and filled hungry stomachs when little else was on the table. A thick slice, spread with lard, or butter if a family could spare the cost, turned this humble loaf into a full meal. In Ireland, brown bread had been tied to peasant life for generations, baked in cottage hearths from oats or wholemeal flour. In Boston, immigrants kept the tradition alive, adapting recipes with American cornmeal or molasses when wheat was scarce. It was sturdy food, dense enough to last, nourishing enough to carry a worker through a long shift. Boston brown bread, often steamed and sweetened, still shows up on local tables today, proving that the survival loaves of Irish immigrants baked their way into American history. What began as a symbol of poverty is now remembered as heritage, carrying both the struggle and the pride of a people who refused to let hardship erase their traditions. 15. Fish chowder. Few dishes tied the Irish closer to Boston than fish chowder. With the harbor just steps away, local fish was cheap and plentiful, making it a natural choice for immigrant families. They would simmer chunks of cod or haddock with potatoes and onions in a simple broth, sometimes thickened with milk if they could afford it. The result was hearty, warming, and easy to stretch for a crowd. Back in Ireland, fish soups were common along the coasts, but Boston gave the Irish access to a whole new abundance of seafood. Chowder became their way of blending old-world habits with new-world resources. A pot could sit on the stove all day, feeding neighbors and family alike, each bowl carrying the salty tang of the Atlantic. Over time, what began as necessity grew into pride. Fish chowder wasn't just survival, it was community in a bowl, a dish that made the rough edges of immigrant life just a little softer. 16. Corned beef hash. In Irish Boston, nothing went to waste, and that's how corned beef hash was born. After a boiled dinner, families would chop the leftover meat and potatoes, toss them in a skillet with onions, and fry everything until it turned crisp and golden. What had been yesterday's scraps became today's breakfast, hearty enough to fuel laborers through long shifts on the docks or in the mills. This dish was pure practicality. Meat was expensive, potatoes were precious, and stretching food was a matter of survival. Hash turned less into enough. It also carried a special comfort. The smell of sizzling beef and onions filled tiny tenements with a sense of home, even when money was gone. What began as an immigrant's way of scraping by grew into an American staple. Corned beef hash still sits proudly on Boston breakfast plates today, proof that food born from hardship can rise to become tradition. 17. Meat and vegetable hash or stew. For Irish immigrants in Boston, hash often meant whatever scraps could be boiled together. Bits of leftover meat, cabbage leaves, potato chunks, and stray carrots all went into one pot. Nothing matched, nothing was wasted, and yet the result was a filling stew that kept whole families alive. This kind of cooking was born out of poverty. In the crowded markets, butchers would sometimes sell bones with a little meat clinging on, or scraps too tough for wealthier customers. The Irish grabbed them, stretched them with root vegetables, and turned them into something hearty. It wasn't about flavor as much as survival, but when shared at a crowded table, it felt like enough. These stews weren't just food, they were proof of resilience. Every bubbling pot reminded families that no matter how little they had, they could still create warmth, nourishment, and the strength to face another day. 18. Potato pancake or griddle cakes. When potatoes were left over, and in Irish kitchens they almost always were, they got a second life as potato pancakes. Known back in Ireland as boxty, these griddle cakes were made by mixing mashed potatoes with flour, maybe an egg if the family had one, and frying them until golden on a hot pan. Crisp on the outside, soft inside, they were cheap, quick, and filling. In Boston's tenements, this dish was pure resourcefulness. It turned yesterday's boiled potatoes into today's breakfast or supper. Families could stretch a handful of spuds to feed everyone, and kids loved them because they felt like a treat compared to plain porridge or boiled roots. A little butter or lard added richness, but even without it, the pancakes carried warmth and comfort. Potato pancakes became more than a way to save food. They were a taste of tradition. Every bite reminded families that even in a strange city, they could keep a piece of Ireland alive on their plates. 19. Turnip and cabbage stew with salt pork bits. For many Irish families in Boston, turnip and cabbage stew with a few scraps of salt pork was the definition of survival cooking. The pork wasn't much, often just fatty trimmings or rind, but boiled with cabbage and turnips, it released enough flavor to transform plain vegetables into a hearty, smoky stew. This was peasant food in its purest form. The story of Irish food in Boston isn't just about recipes, it's about survival, memory, and transformation. Every dish, from humble porridge to hearty stew, carried the weight of the famine and the promise of a new life. These meals were more than calories. They were symbols of resilience, of mothers stretching scraps to feed hungry children, of fathers finding comfort after long shifts at the docks, of neighbors sharing when there wasn't enough. What began as survival food in crowded tenements eventually grew into the backbone of Boston's culinary identity. Corned beef dinners on St. Patrick's Day, steaming bowls of chowder, soda bread in every bakery. All of it traces back to those first Irish immigrants who made do with what little they had. Their story lives on in every bite, reminding us that the taste of history is never far from the table. If this journey through the kitchens of 19th century Boston stirred something in you, imagine what else history has left on our plates. Subscribe for more forgotten meals that shaped America, hit like if you've ever tasted one of these dishes, and drop a comment with the Irish food that's closest to your heart. Because food isn't just what we eat, it's the story of who we are and who we became.